Ladies and gentlemen, Charlie came. He came to Deer Haven. See money. Thank you for coming, sir. It's a delight to have
Nice
you.
to be here.
I really love speaking with you. And Charlie, because he's a saint, has gone through the Map Is Indestructible, and we've been talking, and I really appreciate his depth of reading, his depth of thought, and I think he's getting at exactly what we need to think and talk about and take on today. So thank you, See Money. It really matters. And it's raining today, and it's actually a nice rain. It's soft. Usually we've been getting these blistering flood rains in July in Virginia, so you've brought actual rain that isn't trying to...
It's not too bad out here.
No, it's just this is actually good for the garden, so it's a blessing, etc. But no, it's wonderful to have him, and the Map Is Indestructible is book 2, volume 2 of a trilogy called The True Isn't the Rational, that Michelle and I, we've kind of been wrestling with for a decade or so. And the first volume is called The Conflict of Mind, and it's not the case that you have to read The Conflict of Mind at all to get The Map Is Indestructible. They're just kind of a building conversation. But one of the key ideas of The Map Is Indestructible, like that the subtitle says, is the problem of internally consistent systems. And what that is, and the book will call these maps, and it's going to talk about Alfred Korbosky, Science and Sanity, and he's kind of the one attributed the phrase, the map is not the territory. But what he means by that is, the phrase over time has simply been, oh, well, ideas are not the same as the things. But he's trying to get at this, at really being the center of what it requires to be sane. Because if you forget the map is not the territory, you go crazy. And if you forget, and then furthermore, what that would mean is that identification, like a simple A is a tree is a tree, is actually setting you up for madness. Because things are not simple equal signs. They're not simple identification. And he was really warning at the beginning of the 20th century that if we don't rethink our language, we don't rethink our logic, our politics, our economics, everything, to remove, I think at one point he calls it the virus of identification. It's like a mind virus. And he's like, if we don't remove this, we will actually basically have, well, a loss of mental health, the great spread of mental illness. And he also thought it would be politically consequential, socially consequential, and lead to all sorts of problems. And of course, as tends to occur with super important books, it was forgotten, overlooked, and lost. And a lot of his thinking, which I associate with the Modern Counterenlightenment, as I like to call it, which is this movement of philosophy, I think was basically missed and forsaken. All of these thinkers are warning about very similar things. And by missing them, we've just kind of been, we've been stuck in either a modernity that leads to an autonomous rationality that gives us totalitarianism, or a post-modernity that might critique the totalization, but then it just ever fragments, and you get what the book calls map proliferation. But this means we have to think the problem of identification. But this is a very deep problem, and then I'll just say a few more things and pass it, is that this leads to the problem of an internally consistent system. And what that is the idea that thought naturally creates a map or a way of understanding reality that entails no essential contradictions, meaning there is nothing within the way that it structures reality to itself that necessarily means it's wrong. It could be true. But of course the problem is it could be internally consistent and not correspond with reality. Well, that's a kind of psychosis. That's a kind of where, you always have an answer to whatever reality throws at you, so you don't have to change. Another way to look at it is the problem of internally consistent systems is that the person never has to change. Thought is trying to achieve a system where the person never has to change.
It's thought motivated by the desire to achieve stasis.
Yes.
Which I technically don't think is thought, but so it's a mistaken act of thought. It's a sinful missing of the mark and of attempted effort to solve a problem. We think we're coming across the problem and we're trying to objectively, linearly reason our way through it. But it turns out the problem isn't linear, it's not objective, and it's not reasonable. And so we're using the inappropriate tools to attack the issue. And I think that's an identity misunderstanding because you don't understand your body and you don't understand your environment and you don't understand how to solve the problem of body, environment, homo habilis working together to survive, to cohabitate, to co-create, to continue to live off of each other. I think that's the relationship between man and other humanity and the world, self and other, friend and whatever. Like, we're not doing these borders properly. We're not identifying appropriately with the other. And that's causing an internally consistent system because we're trying to think our way through it, and then we're triangulating through representations, which are then the maps, and then they're not the territory, and then we're acting as though the maps are the territory, and then words are even breaking down. It's even hard to explain the confusion of the problem. It's something like that.
That's very well put. I think this notion of the problem is what ends up happening in the internally consistent system. People would say, well, of course I still believe there are other people. No, but you understand otherness in terms of your worldview, not otherness in terms of the other's worldview. Like, that's where, and when you said that basically identification is not thinking, yeah, it's like a false form of thinking that presents itself as thinking that really isn't thinking. And that's where, like, the paper at the, on critical thinking basically is saying that critical thinking, if we take that as a valid term, is not simply thinking well. It is a mode where thinking is critiquing the very way that thinking represents reality to it. It's more like the movie critic is a critic of the structure of the movie. Like, we haven't begun thinking. You don't begin thinking until you're a critic of the way that thinking represents reality to you. Until that point, you're simply dealing with the motions of thought, or you're just dealing with a kind of experience that is logically constructed, but it's more, you're just absorbing. Like, there's a paper in the Conflict of Mind called Compelling, which wants to argue that mostly what we do is absorb. We don't actually kind of critique it, in a sense. And until we engage in thought that is critiquing the way that thought presents reality to us, we have not engaged in thought.
So there was something you were saying earlier where A isn't A. We think that reality or whatever. So we tend to overfit to the data. So what we have to learn is not the structure of the data itself, isolated independent data, but what does this data mean for me? Or what does this information, how does that apply to the way I need to survive in my habitat?
Right.
And so there's a human informational interaction that affords a survivability or adaptability in the environment. And so it isn't what is the information, I'm a computer, what is the program, let me auto-program this and then I'll regurgitate a program. It's more like, how do I live in the world? And so the example earlier was like, when do I plant my strawberries? And it's like, do you plant it based on when the calendar says? Or are you present and you're familiar with the patterns and you understand how to relate to the world, and you can just instinctually or gut or driven or intuitionally just kind of know how to plant strawberries because you've been doing it for years and that's part of your identity.
Right.
And then when are you acting like a computer to fit to data who then needs to be programmed to plant your strawberries on the 1st of whatever.
Right.
And so then how do we, because I heard you say that the information isn't information or something like that. Like the A isn't A, or like that's not useful. And I don't think people understand why.
Right.
And so there's a difference between information and like applicability or livability or the significance to the individual or how an individual cares or utilizes it or interacts with it. And so there's a difference between the information as the map and then the map that allows you, that affords you the ability to traverse the territory.
Excellent.
And so it's actually, how do we get people traversing is what is meaningful, is what matters.
Yes.
And then the literal explicit directions of left and right at 42 yards, like, that actually doesn't matter as much. And so we're not focusing on walk 12 feet at 45 degrees and then here and then here and then here and then that's how you get here.
Right.
It's more like follow your internal moral compass and your conscience, and then you have a sort of through line of intuitional guidance that then from beneath you drives up and motivates you and compels you towards something. Not, I have no internally consistent system, and so what is some sort of top down, I mean, no, I have no internal self. Right. And so what is some sort of system that I can use instead of my presence, instead of my moral compass, instead of my sensitivity? How can I just look at a GPS and follow directions? Or how can I just download a Excel spreadsheet? Or how can I download a program?
Right.
And so that's what I was trying to get at, is like the program, the information actually doesn't matter.
Right.
Like, I can give you a microchip full of programs, but if you're not a computer that can run that, and if that computer running program doesn't improve somebody else's life, well, then there's no point.
Right.
And so that's, I don't know, I think that I feel like that doesn't necessarily land home to the non-philosophically inclined audience.
I think that's very, very well put. So a few things on the A is A idea and why identification is problematic is the way that kind of Hegel will put it, and that Korbowski is also getting at, is the notion that if I say a tree is a tree, it's an empty, it's kind of vacuous is the phrase, because what's a tree? And here's the issue. The moment you ask what is a tree, I'm going to have to start saying, well, it has leaves, it has limbs, it has roots. Oh, so I have to start describing things that are not a tree. I have to pass over into otherness to tell you what a tree is,
Do you
right?
want to sit in the shade? Do you want to eat the fruit of
Yeah.
it? Do you want to turn it into a house?
That's-
Do you turn it into a
this is
canoe?
the
Like,
issue.
what is a tree?
By identifying what is a tree,
What is
in
it?
no way whatsoever does that say what I ought to do regarding the tree. And in what ways can a tree be used or employed and still be a tree? When does a tree cease being a tree is also not given by the idea of A is A. Because there's clearly a point where if I cut down a tree and slice it up into boards, is it still a tree or is it now boards? Like, at what point does the A turn into B, per se, and become something else? But if A can become B, if a tree can become boards, then it must, in its isness, contain the potentiality for that becoming other, and that becoming other must be present even when it's just a tree, right? So that it can so change into boards, right? So the notion that Hegel is getting at is that the problem with A is when I say a tree is a tree, I can't even tell you what that means, and unless I pass over into otherness. So the question is, what exactly are we doing then when we say a tree is a tree, right? Well, Hegel basically is warning, and Korbowski is always like, we're actually kind of doing nothing.
Right.
We're not doing
Not
anything
really.
at all.
And I
But
think that's most of human communication.
yes, we're doing nothing at all.
Is saying things that don't matter and don't mean anything.
Yes, because the only way something can matter is if it has the passing over into otherness mechanism there, if it has momentum.
Right.
And that's where Korbowski, like the book will emphasize situation and movement, is the notion that Korbowski is like intelligibility is a product of a movement. Like that, like the intelligibility does not come from me saying a tree is a tree.
It's real. It's processing. It's lived out. It's
Yes,
yeah. It's real.
that's exactly right. And so there's
This isn't real because
Yeah.
this isn't going anywhere
that's correct.
because it's not related.
That's correct. And so for Korbowski, yeah, and he explicitly says basically the same as Barfield on the idea that there are no things, there are just relations. And the issue is that the problem is, so Korbowski is a semantic. He's in the semantic movement, kind of like Peirce and people like that. And what he wants to warn is, in a very real sense, there are no such thing as nouns. When you talk
Yes.
about a car, there are no nouns.
And that's McGillchrist the matter with things.
Yeah, yeah.
There are no nouns, only adverbs.
Yeah, and absolutely, Korbowski is
Yeah.
is a thinker of McGillchrist. He is in that line, and so the problem is we use a language that is constantly habituating us to nouns,
Yes.
and as a result, we forget that there are not nouns, and then we take that training from language and put it on reality, and thus we start making reality into an image and likeness that's auto-cannibalistic. So,
Yeah, that reminds me of this. So it's a concept of metaphorical substrate that
Yes.
I've seen on a couple, YouTube videos talking about Jordan Peterson. But there's something about what you were saying right there with the A is A, which sort of implies an objective, factual this equals this.
yes,
And what that does is that carries a set of implications or spiritual interpretations or characteristic understanding of the world that then sort of imposes an objective framework that the tree is the tree, which is different than being a subject of like, do I need shade, or do I want a house, or do I want fruit, or like there's a different sort of metaphorical substrate in the implication of what a word is and what a word means, which
Yes.
then gets back to that data.
yes,
We are used to speaking data that actually isn't meaningful.
Yes.
And so how do we alter the metaphorical substrate in such a way that we're speaking more subjectively or inspirationally speaking that then activates a sort of participation in the audience,
yes,
rather than some sort of top-down, here is the map, and then they can just scan it, recognize it, know it, and file it away. That isn't actually something they have to journey and change and grow and live and experience and live and breathe and consume that daily bread and then be altered by that experience. Like there's a different metaphorical substrate between giving an object of irrelevance that is then like consumed and ignored versus bringing a subject of experience that then the audience has to then participate
Yes.
in, of which they then relate, of which they then connect to the other, of which they then receive information, of which they change, of which they reorient, and
Yes.
then they're more mature, or they're more wise, or they're more informed, or they have then benefited from the conversation, which is
Yes.
why you're opening your mouth in the first place.
Yes, I mean,
And so this is the metaphorical substrate that I think is key to why this conversation is so hard to have.
100%, because then the very substrate creates a kind of barrier to understanding the discussion of the substrate, which then
Exactly.
preserves
It creates
the
a
substrate.
confusion. It
Yeah.
creates a confusion, and then we identify with the confusion, and then we aim our psychic energy at the confusion, and then we will necessarily miss the mark because the way that we're aiming our attention is inherently
Yes.
inappropriate,
Yes.
irrelevant, insignificant.
Yes.
I don't. Again, the words are tough here.
Well,
But-
no, I completely agree. All maps want to vanish. It's that idea of the map vanishing, and there are various strategies that maps employ to vanish and become quote-unquote isness. A map does not want to be recognized as a map, because then you might realize all this,
'Cause
right?
then it's real.
Could-
Or then it's
Something you can change, something you can identify and change
so-
your orientation
So
to.
what is this desire for that which is unchangeable? What is this desire towards the static, and why are we so resistant to that changing, relating journey of participation, of openness?
I think that's-
why is it that, why do we want the internally consistent system? Why do we want that wall? Why do we want the concept to act instead of our presence? Where is the fear of being present, or where is, what's going on here?
Oh,
Sorry.
it's magnificent.
Too much.
So because if you encounter otherness, you have to put, I'll reference Jordan Peterson in his book Maps of Meaning, which is talked about toward the end, is the idea that without maps, humans can't even make sense of reality. Like there is no such thing as pure objective thought. And so this is important because, before I forget, everything you were saying about basic, like Korbosky is calling for nothing short of a semantic revolution. Like he's like, if we don't revolutionize and radically and intentionally, almost like employing a Manhattan Project, if we don't radically employ such a project to change how we use language and think about language, we're going to end up in a very bad place. So he's calling for a massive semantic revolution.
Yeah. That gets me to something that cheap empathy and costly empathy, or
Yes.
something like that. And so there's something about modernity, modern taker culture, MTC, that we're in a meeting crisis, and it seems as though we're trying to shallowly distract ourselves out of it.
Yes.
And so how do we get into the depths of the problem, into where the real issue is? And if that is kind of the core of how the psyche works, then in a sense it is a sort of Manhattan Project. It is a sort of Christ death. It is a sort of total personality death. There is a sort of phoenix alchemy that burns up on the flames that actually does totally reorient.
Yes.
And so it does, I do think we're getting to that point of a Manhattan Project, or of a explosion point or an implosion point. If it's an internally consistent system, I guess it would be an implosion, but whatever that is, we're not connecting. Something's not there.
Well, there is something to be said, like, if this continues because of the necessary political ramifications of map making that is not identified, that leads to this oscillation between map totalization and map proliferation, and every single map becomes a totality to itself, that will inevitably lead to a global crisis that will be a forcing function that will necessitate this Manhattan Project. So I completely agree. And there could be an argument that ultimately nothing but a forcing function could bring this about, which, historically speaking, it's either a mystical, beautiful experience or a forcing function of some kind that brings
Or
it
a
about.
trauma.
Or trauma,
Right.
yes.
And so at some point, what's the difference between it relating to the real? If it's good, then it's a mystical thing, and if it's bad, well, then it's traumatic.
Yeah.
But like those are almost the same.
Yes.
And there's like a subtle difference, pun intended.
Yes.
And so how do we have the proper discretion? How do we have the proper presence to access the internal conscious judgment that accesses the through line that is the mystical transcendent with the real that then guides you appropriately?
Yes.
That is like the opposite of the metaphorical substrate of the collapsed objective. I already know what this is, and this is the border that is my personality, and I know this.
Yes.
And
Yeah.
so, yeah,
I
sorry,
mean,
I'm kind of getting lost.
no.
But
For
there's
me, I
something-
call it, the real is the quote-unquote Lovecraft with the craft in parentheses. It is both the potential beatific vision of Dante, the love that moves the sun and other stars, and the ancient one that reduces you to ass. In the same way that there's traditions of saying God is hell to those who hate him, and he's heaven to those who love him. And it's not that,
Definitely.
it's not that God, it's not so much that God judges you and looks at you and says, go to hell. It's that the very experience of beauty and goodness, if you have sin, actually is a terror
yes.
to you. Basically,
and that's I think the status of today. We have
Yes.
all of these ideas that we think are correct. And then that actually loads like a sort of, those are givens, the givens that are passed down from the culture, the institutions, the empty institutions of the givens that are passed down from the culture, then become the original sin that aim our psychic attention misdirected.
Yes. Well, for me, the territory is Lovecraft in a sense. It is that craft with the parentheses. And that, because whenever you find out, and even though I'm not saying it's the same as God, I mean, ultimately there's a sense in which it's the ground of all being, etc., so forth, it is of the real. That's right. But the issue is that I think every time the human actually approaches the territory, per se, that is not reducible to the map, they have a kind of experience of Lovecraft with the craft in parentheses. It is either going to be an opening that is beautiful to them, or it will be a terror. And in fact, it tends to be you have to go through the trauma to be open to the beauty, and it's actually both. Like every sort of, and this is actually getting back to your question of why do we make this mistake of the substract, is because precisely moving out of the mistake of maps requires an encounter with the Lovecraft that is difficult.
Right,
And then if you've been trained to think that if it feels bad, it's wrong, then as you approach it, you
it's
interpret.
uncomfortable, it's scary. I don't want to do that.
And therefore, I've been taught to associate that emotional experience with wrong. Therefore, it's rational not to do, and so you enclose yourself, right? One of the great benefits of religious teachings is actually just because it feels bad does not mean it's bad. In fact, it might be facing the sin and overcoming the sin. You may need to lean into the bad.
I think that's where we are right now.
Yes.
Is that we're so culturally habituated to aim towards the stasis of hiding behind a concept.
Yes.
That whatever the presence is that would afford us the ability to connect or love or make meaning or do something that matters, like you were just saying, it feels wrong, it feels scary.
Yeah, it feels
that's
scary.
not no, I'm not in my little comfort zone. I don't want to do that.
Yep, that's right.
And so then the natural person, when presented with an opportunity to make meaning, is scared and shuts down.
That's correct.
And so that is the state of modernity, and the more civilized and big city you are, the more that vibrational frequency is going to subconsciously be prodding you.
Absolutely.
And so my then, how do we fix this, would be to create a sort of, I don't know, place where you could go to then confront chaos.
Yes.
To then be in that state of unknown. And so it's like we're too overloaded with the real that we then are scared and need to put up barriers.
Yes.
And then we habitually think that it's good to put up barriers so that the real never comes in.
Exactly.
How do we then get people to realize that no, you have to relate with the real and then have some barriers. But it's not you put barriers instead of the real. And there's something about that subtle difference that I think is the difference between adaptability and madness.
Yes.
Or is the difference between
Yes.
surviving and an auto-cannibalistic delusion of whatever.
Well, what you're getting at is also another reason why we stay in our maps, because if you go outside the map, you have to somehow know the difference between madness and adaptability. But it is outside. But the map is what gives you the intelligibility to make those discernments.
So the paradox.
So this is the paradox. See, the problem is, and this is what Peterson.
So
It's
then
not rational.
what part of your personality is non-rational?
Exactly.
Because I think the MTC is over-identified with the ego that
Yes.
is that is left hemispherically given the rational
Yes.
substrate.
Yes.
So how do we remember that we are not just the egoic left hemispheric top-down
That's it.
representation? How do we remember that we are the presence that then, I don't know, creates maps, that then our ego feels thrown into and confined by the facticity of the map that we're given?
Exactly.
How do we remember that we're not the ego given the map, we are some sort of self, capital S, or some sort of spirit or soul that lives in the world, and through openly living with that, then we regurgitate a map? How do we not say, hey, I'm given a map, let me follow the map, but like, here is a map because I lived real, and I'm real, and then here's kind of a map. And then the map then becomes a representation of what was real.
Yes.
Not a faux simulacrum of profelicity, of pretense of this is how I be real by acting out this form like a machine.
Yes.
And somewhere in there. Yeah.
100%. So before I forget, this is the stakes. Why is Plato and classical thinkers, Plato, Socrates, Aristotle, all know Plato, why is Plato so adamant on basically wanting to prove the eternity of the soul? Because if the soul is eternal, then this can be addressed that you just described. If it is not eternal, there's no outside, and so that's it. And then also Plato is perpetually interested in memory, remembering. The slave boy remembers geometry, because it's like, well, the way you're able to do that is the eternity of the soul. So if there is no, this is the claim, if there is no eternity of the soul, there is no possibility of changing the way you use maps. There's no way of remembering an intelligibility that is beyond the intelligibility given by maps that would nevertheless be sensible, right? Because if the soul is eternal, then it has within it the potentiality of an operation that is distinct from the intelligibility given by the map, right? It's mysterious, it's difficult to apprehend, but it is non-rational and yet not chaos.
Unknowable.
Yes.
It's almost like by definition, it's like inherently outside of the bounds of knowing. It's outside of the scope of knowledge, of abstract knowledge.
Yeah, absolutely it is. The weird thing with it is an unknown that unfolds. And this is also the absolute idea for Hegel, is the idea that yes, it is unknown, but it is not unintelligible because it unfolds through time. And so what ends up happening is you can never finish it. You can never know the entirety of it. You can never know where it is going, but you can know that it is going. You can never identify the destination, but you can follow it in a manner where there is a destination, because if it takes you somewhere, then there's a destination, right? But then this is faith, trust, and courage and stuff like that, right? So the key is the claim that the real, or the Lovecraft, has the characteristics of an unknown that is wooing, that is actually unfolding. But the only way to relate to it is a certain level of trust. Because the difference, you could say, between abstract knowing and I'll talk about calculation and apprehension. The difference is calculation, you can know the end. You could argue the entire idea of a program and autonomous rationality is to know the outcome before getting there. You'd be like, you kind of have a program.
That's what I was talking about earlier.
Yeah, the GPS, kind of.
We're trying to program everything.
That's correct.
That's our disposition. That's our stance.
Yes, because...
I think that's the foolish stance. Sorry.
Yes, absolutely.
That's the normal stance.
Absolutely it is, and one could say another reason why we make all the mistakes we're describing is because that normal stance, in a sense, is safer. It is less risky. It seems to be a better survival strategy.
It's more consistent.
It's more consistent, and you can say, well, if I do this, I know
We've mistaken consistency for understanding.
Yes, we have. And it's basically just a survival mechanism. And also, but here's the issue: if you go into the Lovecraft, there is real risk. That, if you actually take seriously the Gödel Point and you take seriously the problem of maps, there is real risk.
Definitely. Because
if you, and actually you could argue the, dare I say, blessing of postmodernity is that it has actually showed us what happens if you deconstruct maps as opposed to changing your relationship to maps to unveil an opening to the other, because those are not necessarily the same. Now, when you read someone like a Derrida, who I have great respect for Derrida because I think he's nuanced. It's the deconstructionists who take him and become less nuanced. But the idea of Derrida is there's this idea that deconstruction is supposed to be justice. Well, what does he mean by that? Is the idea that as long as we have ideology or maps, there is always going to be the problem of, well, internally consistent systems that become totalitarian, and you relive the Nazi Party, you relive Stalinism, you relive this thing. So we better get rid of maps. Here's the problem. You can't do that. And so if you get, and this is where Peterson is correct, if you get rid of maps, people go psychotic. And they still end up in totalitarianism because when people are psychotic, they look for a strong man to make everything sensible again. So the problem is that you can't, the book is trying to, the Map Is Indestructible as the book is trying to find the fine line between not deconstructing maps, but existing and dwelling in maps in such a way that opens them in the Gödel Point, right? That's the fine balance. And the issue is, though, if you do that, there is real risk. Because you can encounter the Lovecraft, not be ready for it, and be reduced to ash, or, not have the virtue to handle it. So there's a reason why people avoid it. And also, too, it's so much work to even establish the coherence of a map. Like, to actually find the internal consistency of a map, you can make a career out of that. You can spend a life doing that. So what do you mean, guys? You're saying we should spend all this time to determine internal consistency for the sake of finding the point where it no longer applies? That's really counterproductive. That's counterintuitive.
You would think, yeah.
Yeah, why not just use, I don't know, consistent systems to make societies? Well, that's what a lot of people do, but here's the problem. It must keep out otherness. It must ultimately keep out as, Peterson talks a lot in Maps of Meaning about the idea of the stranger. And the problem of the stranger that every society has to face is a stranger can set, I believe the phrase he uses is a cascade. It can set off a cascade of questioning everything, and then it becomes chaos. Because if you're the Christian and you encounter the atheist, and the atheist makes you question, well, that could set off a cascade where your entire way of life is taken away, right? And that's happened to many people, and many people have gone through deconstruction, the Christian movements of deconstruction, blah blah blah.
Isn't that what's happening to society?
Absolutely, it's what's happening. The meaning crisis is a cascade crisis, basically.
So how does that as above, so below work? How can we make that more apparent to people?
Well, I think. So this, to kind of look ahead, ultimately what is required to say something very large, because you were also talking about the problem of unveiling people at a rate they can handle so that they don't identify the border as the map. There is basically an entirely new social infrastructure that is needed that I associate with the social coordination mechanism, which people are using. Zoom, YouTube, Philosophy Portal, this corner of the internet is using it in this manner, where you are socially coordinating people to interact with other people in a manner that has an ongoing discussion. You need to change the school system from being test-based to oral-based. You need to remove the resume and replace it with the portfolio. And you also need to change the structure of regulation, which has led to basically people joining corporations versus doing more entrepreneurship or making their own businesses. You need to increase fluency in the system, like the amount of fluency in the system, because all of the incentives now are actually for stable states. You want a business that is stable. You want a resume that is stable. You want everything is incentivized. Social intelligibility is stability. All the incentives is status, resume, stable things. Well, if you have that, then basically you have a social order that incentivizes identification. So you have to increase the probability that people associate fluency with a good use of time, and that requires some social structural changes. But these changes are not telling people what they should do or be. That's the key. How do you, because if you're trying to predict the future or make the future, then you're totalitarian. But you can change the conditions of possibility now in the present to increase the probability of a future that doesn't make the mistake of AA logic and actually is more likely to naturally habitually think according to AB or the Gödel point or process and relationships. That is not closing down and saying what the future must be. That's the fine balance you have to run, is not forcing a future, but let me put it this way. You have this danger of saying, well, we gotta go in and force everyone to think a certain way, which can be totalitarian. Or you have the manner of, we need to increase fluency in the system so that whatever way people choose to think, it has a different quality. Where instead of being primarily identification, it's relational, it's situation, and it's open, right? Where you're adding a Gödel point to every possible worldview is how I would kind of put it. To Christianity, to atheism, to Islam, to capitalism, to communism, to whatever. You're trying to add it. What needs to happen is the social incentives change to where it increases the probability that people will add a Gödel point to their worldview, whatever that may be, or to their map. If everyone did that, that means there's a point of openness instead of a closeness, and from that you can have this possibility of people being in their maps but open at the same time. But that gets into structural and social incentives. Now, basically, if you take all this seriously, you have to change the social and political infrastructure away from creating an incentive landscape of identification, things versus relation, algebra versus geometry. There are different languages. You could basically say it this way: the social order incentivizes auto-cannibalism ultimately by its logic.
Right.
It does not.
Metaphorical substrate I mentioned earlier.
Yes.
Is that's the implication of the logic. Then is
Yeah, that's correct. And you see what's happening now, as a kind of to take a larger. We have a lot of political responses to, I think, a subconscious recognition that something is not working, but right now the something that is not working is still being projected onto the other as they're the problem, as opposed to seeing openness to the other as the address. And so what you have is political, social, and economic responses that are a reaction to a sense of auto-cannibalism that is nevertheless representing the logic of auto-cannibalism in different forms. But since it feels like a change, it feels like you're doing something, but you're actually not. And that's why identifying the problem as ultimately AA versus AB, to put, to sum up a lot in those phrases. Like, if you're just doing another form of AA, it's not a change. actually. It's the same logical form in repetition. And if you repeat the same logical form, you can do something different and it's still going to be auto-cannibalism. And basically, whether it be map totalization, map proliferation, all of those are still relating to the maps as consistency being the goal of them, as opposed to using the map to find the Gödel point by which they open up to the other. And as long as we keep doing that and then don't change the infrastructure to create incentives to do that, you're just going to have trouble upon trouble upon trouble.
So then that gets me sort of to identity, because I think a lot of this meaning crisis is an identity crisis.
Yes.
Is a confusion of who we are, where we are, what we're doing, what we're supposed to be doing.
Yes.
And I think a lot of this is, to maybe use Jungian terms, we are too egocentric. We've lost contact with the overall self, and we now find ourselves thrown into the facticity of the self-conscious monkey mind ego. And then we think that's us.
Yes.
And then that self-conscious monkey mind ego is almost the emergent abstract complex of the left hemisphere.
Yes.
And so I think the problem with an internally consistent system is that it is the chunk that is being given to the left hemisphere.
Yes.
And then we are like the ego rational processor computer of maps. And then the problem is the map that we're given is like internally consistent or self-referential, or there's no holes in the map, because that's literally how the psyche made sense of it.
Yes.
And so then that was
That's the key.
nugget of, that was the chunk of information, that was the left hemisphere saber of, this is all this chaos, here's a chunk of information. And
Yes.
then the ego receives this chunk of information and is like, oh, life is this chunk.
Yes.
But then that separates it out from everything else. That disconnects it from memory.
Yes.
That makes it an abstracted, separate, almost a dead thing.
Yes.
That then takes it out of the through line of connection, of meaning, of memory, of significance, of implication, of application, of meaning, of salience. It's
Yes.
auto-cannibalistic.
Perfectly put, because it is the very incompleteness of the map that allows the entrance of the ego to create a map as if it is complete. Like, it is the very fact that the experience of the ego of reality is too full. It is too much. And what's very interesting, when something is experienced as too much, you actually experience, it is simultaneous an excess and a lack. Because when you're overwhelmed, you also experience the
Because
lack.
you lack the understanding of it.
Yeah, that's
'Cause
correct.
if you're properly whelmed, then you get it, and then you understand it.
That's-
But if you're overwhelmed, well, then you don't get it, and so
That's-
you're both. Yeah.
That's correct. And so in the excess, there is a lack that is the incentive of the creating of the map to then bring the excess into that which is understood, which flattens it, right? But it is the lack that actually is the creation of the space and the incentive to do this. But then, of course, that lack must not be included, because if you made the map,
And if we're calling it a lack, well, then it isn't anything. So
Exactly.
what are you even talking about,
That's the-
Daniel?
that's the
Daniel,
key.
what are you talking
That's
about?
exactly
How
the
can
key.
we talk about this thing that doesn't exist?
exactly. Well, that's
Shouldn't we just ignore it and keep on our...
there you go. Because lack is rationally that which, if it's not there, then it's rational to disregard, and then you're damned.
So
then
how
you're
is this
locked in.
paradox that that which we don't understand, we can't understand, isn't real and doesn't exist, is also like the most real thing that we have to pay attention to, and we have to learn how to relate to that which we don't understand. How does that make sense given how we're educated in internally consistent systems?
It is
So where's the faithful presence that can access the parts of the psyche that aren't thrown into the facticity that is the presumed taken for granted left hemisphere, top down abstracted, necessarily going to miss the mark because it doesn't understand the base of reality, because it's not rooted. And so Simone Weil, we've lost our roots. McGillchrist, we're all left hemisphere. Whatever that is, we're not then appropriately relating to the other that is the source of the emotion, that is the bottom up connected to the embodiment. We're just receiving top down and then trying to impose that top down and then trying to pretend the body to fake the top down.
Yes.
And then it's like a profile culture of top down pretense. And eventually that doesn't make sense. That's not grounded.
Correct.
And so that's where we are. We lack that grounding. We lack that sense
Yes.
making. We're full of profiles and we're full of shiny things, but we lack the meaning of it and the
Yes.
significance and the applicability of it.
very well put. Basically, we have been using thinking to obtain, you could say, certainty. The problem is certainty is not possible, so this is an illusion. It must be an enclosed structure.
Right.
So if you get certainty, it has to be an illusion. But thinking is in the business of certainty because it doesn't want to be surprised. Thinking naturally doesn't want to be surprised. But what we're alluding to is that actually thinking, it can't even be itself without surprise. So there's a certain paradox at the very heart of thinking. And the paradox you also described is exactly what needs to be thought. That if thinking doesn't think that paradox, it's not even itself. Because thinking must by definition understand itself by creating something it isn't, by passing over into otherness. But if thinking is, dare I say, of the soul, that is excessive, that is of the excess that we experience as lack, then it entails in its very mechanism of understanding that of which in a sense works against itself into a reductionist version so that it can understand itself. But here's the key. That understanding could be the grace of eternity, because that never ends. There's always something more to understand. Or it can feel like hell, because it never ends. So it depends on how you
understand it, because there's no orientation. There's nothing to grasp onto.
That's exactly right.
So there's something about the mind that grasps that feels comfortable.
Yes.
And that's the fruit of knowledge, top-down,
Yes.
abstract intellect.
Yes.
And there's something about the embodiment that relates, that submits, that doesn't know, that feels crucified or
Yes.
sacrificial. And then there's something about modern culture presumes the top down. We take for granted the bottom up, and then we try to enforce the top down.
Yes.
And by constantly taking for granted the bottom up, we've then disconnected from that bottom up, or we've
Yes.
atrophied the ability to appropriately relate to that.
Yes.
And so we're almost thinking non-emotionally. We're
Yes.
thinking instead of emoting, and then the thoughts and because again, emotions are tough but it's the thought and the meaning of it. It's the embodied.
Yes.
Corresponding psychic frequency of
Yes.
relation of otherness of whatever that is.
Yes.
We're like, nope, I just want to do what I want to do.
Yeah.
Or something. Again, I don't know how to explain
Well,
this stuff.
the problem is, so to make a giant metaphysical claim, a lot of our problems are because we have an improper understanding of reality where space is more real than time when really it's time-space. And you see, if you think in terms of time-space, then emotions are motion. The problem becomes when we think emotion in stable state. I am happy versus I'm feeling happy, and that's
doesn't
an
even make sense.
That's correct.
Yeah,
I am happy, therefore that's an orientation of how I move through time space. So likewise, the problem becomes we are, you could say, knowledge. The tree of knowledge wants to make everything space at the expense of time, where actually properly we resist the temptation of space for the sake of time. But that is very counter, because by definition, if you make time primary, there's a humbling, because you don't know it. You have to follow. You have to go with space. I've got space. I don't have to humble everything. So pride sacrifices time for space, and 100%. So knowledge goes. Please.
Yeah. Sorry, I'm not going to map this very well, but there's something with the McGillchrist hemispheric stuff that really seems to track in this space-time representation, abstraction, conceptualization, internally consistent system. Those all seem to vibrationally resonate of the same persona, the same kind of spirit of the left hemisphere.
Yes.
And the mistake is to believe that that is the source of reality.
Yes.
And I think that is the inherent mistake. And so then,
Completely.
to then go back on this, the former was the tree of knowledge, the latter was the tree of life.
Yes.
And so the tree of knowledge activates the left hemisphere, which then reduces the phenomena into a representation, which then allows the ego to dominate it and consume it, because it's then just a logos. And so then there's that sort of spiritual arrogance of top-down, of abstract knowledge.
Yes.
And then there's the time-space, the opposite embodied bottom-up, right hemisphere, submissive, I don't yet know what this is because I'm ongoing. That's humiliating, that's scary, that's disorienting, and that means the other is greater than me, and then I am now responsible to that other.
Yes.
And there's something about modern society educates you in such a way that you are never in the headspace where you are submitting to something greater than you and then attempting to appropriately relate to that.
Yes.
Modern society educates you and orients you to look down and only look for things that are easy to digest and consume.
Yes.
And then that top-down, easy to digest and consume eventually ignores the bottom-up and then creates an insane top-down
Yes.
self-referential feedback loop.
Yes.
That creates a satanic, desire for stasis that then
Yes.
atrophies your presence and makes you unable to procreate because you're not using both energies. You're just
Correct.
using the masculine energy. You're
Correct.
just using the top down. You're
Correct.
just using the yin.
Correct.
And then by only masculine energy, by only yin, by only abstraction, you lose the embodiment, you lose the participation, you lose the feminine, you lose the connection, you lose the meaning, and then we are saber and we've lost connoisseur.
Completely. What ends up happening is so space-time basically says that time is relative to space, and that ultimately there's a block universe, and there is, in a sense, time doesn't even exist, right? Well, then space has to only relate to space. So there is just self-relation. Like, ultimately, the idea that there isn't self-relation in space-time is a kind of illusion, because there's just space relating to space. That is reality. So then from that metaphysics, you get a world where the name of the game is to collect space, to collect possessions, to collect a resume, to collect status, to collect things of which increase your identification in space. But if time-space is most real, then you are only real to the degree that you participate in the unfolding of an unknown. That's why time being primary is a very big deal. And honestly, it would be a larger conversation. The notion of eternity has been interpreted by modernity and moderns, I'll dare say, as merely being timelessness, as in space that doesn't end, when really eternity is an ever-unfolding mystery that doesn't end. And eternity is now. It's just that we have the ability to misidentify it.
I see what you're saying. Okay.
So that's led to a lot of trouble. One of the things, before I forget, that is, so there's a few things. So first off, the problem is, I'll just say the soul. The soul's mechanism of precisely unfolding always creates the possibility of losing sight of the unfolding, because if it didn't, it would have to interpret the excess of reality all at once, which would overwhelm it. Right. And so there always has to be the possibility of misidentification if there's going to be unfolding, right? Well, this is why what's very fascinating to me is this is why the tree of knowledge has to be in the Garden of Eden. AB has to have the risk of AA, because AB can only unfold through a frame that is experienced as if AA, that you sacrifice for the next frame, that you sacrifice for the next frame, that you sacrifice for the next frame. But if there is a frame, a frame of space-time, then you can make the mistake of over-determining that, of over-identifying that. So the tree of knowledge has to be present as a possible mistake in the Garden of Eden, because otherwise there's no way. And critically, there has to be, let me put it this way, there has to be space in the sense of space, rather than time be relative to space, and time-space, which gets into more of a Henry Bergson view of things, and Augusta, et cetera, so forth, is that space is a manifestation of time. Like, what we see around us is time manifesting, and space is more as this creative unfolding, even a Whiteheadian sense. But space is actually the way time manifests to us. It's like the language of time.
See,
right?
yes, that's the language of experience isn't the experience.
Correct.
And we're confusing the language with the experience.
That's correct. But that mistake must be possible, because we have to experience one thing at a time, or else it overwhelms us, and we can then therefore make the mistake of thinking that one at a time is all time. It is the whole, right? Like that characteristic of experience. And so the mistake has to be latent in the proper orientation. But of course, here's the problem. If you make that mistake, though, it then brings with it a logic that closes it off from return.
It's sticky, yeah.
It's
tempting or something, yeah.
Yeah, because once
it's deceptive.
Once I say to you, what do you mean time, space? Look around. All I ever see is space. When you look around, you go, that seems to be true. It does seem to be true that space is more real than time. The natural way you experience things is on the side of making the mistake of enclosure, because it just seems.
The natural way you experience things is through the ego that's already given the left hemispheric chunk.
Yes.
So you naturally experience the representation.
Yes. So what ends up happening is, the space-time and the time-space stuff, that's like we talk about that a lot with, like, Bergson, who I think is important, and Whitehead and other things. But the main point is that what we tend to do is naturally collapse things into space, collapse things into the frame of experience. And we say, we collapse a process into a situation, or relations into things. And Owen Barfield kind of talked about the idea of things as a kind of idolatry, where things become their own ground of being as opposed to in service of God. But the issue is that once we collapse things, we then get in a habit of collapsing things, and then we habituate ourselves to our collapsed understanding of reality, which then creates a mechanism of reinforcement. So once you create an internally consistent system, you get in a habit of thinking in terms of that internally consistent system. And it's funny because, like, to get at what you've said is, we tend to sacrifice the interior, the internal, the heart, for the internally consistent system, and so you lose the through line, you lose the soul. Once you do that, once you lose your soul, it's real hard to get your soul back. But you get into habits of doing that, and once you get into those habits, you lose the capacity to think outside of it. And so ultimately, when we're talking about social, political, educational, like, all of these are questions of what kind of habits are you going to form. Because, and habits get tied to Aristotle's virtue ethics. James K. Smith, he has that lovely book, and he, the more, his trilogy is like Desiring the Kingdom, but he has that book called, You Are What You Love. And it's this idea that what you love is what you form habits around, and your habits are who you are. And there's a strong connection between habits and personhood. And the problem is, where we really get in trouble, and I'll give it to you, is that we collapse reality into things, and then we love those things, we love that idolatry, and we form habits in light of that idolatry, and then anyone who wants us to give them up, they're betraying our loves, and they get our passions, which our passions are violent and very problematic. So there's a mechanism of collapsing to habit formation that then has to be reversed. Like, you have to have a society that generates different habits that are going to be more on the side of keeping things open.
Yeah, I always struggle here, because I think that, I don't know, if you talk about Peterson in canonical works, he talks about the Bible being the most canonical, and he talks about the Bible being kind of the center of Western culture. And so then if the Bible is the center of Western culture, I know that's an argument, but just bear with me. And then the Garden of Eden is the origin story of that. Then it seems like our whole culture is built on the fact that our identity as humans is based on a sort of Garden of Eden relationship. And so then that mythological story narrative is supposed to be somewhat of a symbolic or mythical representation of how the human mind works.
Right.
And so then that story of the Bible is actually the identity story of our culture, which is actually the way we are supposed to organize our psyche. Mm-hmm. And so I think that if you break that down, you have the two trees in the center of the Garden of Eden. You have man and God walk together, and then there's a certain, then that's the dawn of man, and then that's the story of humanity. And so then if you take evolution and you go from Homo habilis to Homo erectus to Homo sapien, you go from man who interdepends on his habitat for survival, and then he grows and he evolves and he complexifies, and then he's able to stand up and use his hands. And then by manhandling, manos in Spanish, you are then able to manhandle the world and stand up.
Yes.
And so then that was an evolutionary, whatever, adaptation, acceptation, whatever, you increased your skills. You raised your ability, and then that means you need a different name.
Yes.
And so then that new name that described was Homo erectus.
Right.
And then that thing started getting abstract representations. That thing started mapping the world, and then that thing started living through its abstract mapped representations of the world.
Right.
And then that thing became interdependent on surviving its habitat through using sapiential frameworks.
Yes.
And so then we had to become Homo sapiens.
Yes.
And so then what I'm trying to say is that the Bible is the story of what it means to be a Homo sapien.
Yeah.
And so what it means to be a Homo sapien is to be a man who is in a relation with God, who is in a garden.
Yes.
And that's a walled garden, that's an organized structure. And within that organized structure, you have two sources of food. You have the food of life, the tree of knowledge of life, and you have the tree of knowledge of good and evil.
Right.
And I think the tree of life is somewhat of your your right hemisphere chamber, and then the tree of knowledge is like your left hemisphere.
Right.
And so, like, what does it mean to be a Homo sapien is to have two different ways of ingesting the world and learning. And one of those is through embodied experience, where you don't know what's happening. It's still ongoing, it's still emerging, it's still relating. You are conocering, you're connecting to it, it's ongoing, and you don't know what it is.
Right.
But you're living it, and it's real, and that living is a form of life, and that's a form of understanding.
Right.
And then you have the tree of abstracted, top-down knowledge that's good and evil, that's right and wrong, that's predetermined, that this goes here and this goes here. And my theory is that alongside of McGillchrist, where he's saying that modernity is captured by left hemispheric domination, I think that spiritually our modern culture is captivated by the intellect that eats the fruit of knowledge that looks top-down.
Yes.
Sorry, this is a really long way of piggybacking on your habits.
Yeah.
What is the habit? What I'm trying to say about modern taker culture is that we are that which has been aimed and educated and formed, and we have built our personality by consuming the daily bread of top-down knowledge.
Yes.
And if you consume a habit of top-down, you atrophy bottom-up.
Yes, you do.
You sever your connection to bottom-up.
Yes.
Or Lucifer rebels against God, and then you disconnect, and then you're just an abstract ideas without the embodied experience that correlate.
Yes.
And so there's something about with great power comes great responsibility.
Yes.
With great ability to abstract comes great
Yes.
responsibility to embody and resonate and
Yes.
stuff.
Yes.
And so the modern organized civilization has given the intellect steroids while numbing the body. But
No,
it's
you were spot on.
something like that, I think, is what's happening as above, so below to each individual, as well as the institutions, as well as the culture, as well as the incentive landscape that we find ourselves thrown into, and then we mistakenly think we are limited by the structures that we are thrown into based on how the mind can only understand maps, can only orient towards yin, can only understand walls.
Yes.
And so then we are habitually consuming what we think is our understanding, but actually, paradoxically or ironically, that's then limiting us, that's then severing our consciousness, that's then atrophying our ability to relate to the real, which then makes us infantile, emotionally immature, and eventually we're going to crumble into either a fit or a panic attack or a delusion or whatever the overwhelming confrontation with the real is, where you don't have your little safety BS measures of fruit of knowledge to protect you and sever your connection, something like that.
1,000,000%, and everything you just said is, I think, manifesting politically, socially today.
As above, so below, everywhere.
And
It's
so
everywhere.
it is very, very important. So there's a few things. I agree 100% with everything you said about atrophy. If you get into the habit of top down, then you atrophy your capacity for bottom up, and then what ends up happening when the day arrives where you require the bottom up, you will either rebel against that, you go into nihilism, you'll go into...
You'll think it's scary and you don't want to do it.
Yeah, or you'll turn to a strong man that says you don't have to do it, and so this politically manifests. The consequences of dying.
That's the Peterson temptation to ideology.
Yes.
We've become weaker and weaker, and now we're susceptible to ideology.
Yes.
We don't have that internal mass, the atomic mass, the atomic mass that is our own personality to withstand a confrontation with the real.
Yes.
We're just this top-down illusion of whatever that then doesn't have the integrity to listen or to submit or to experience and be present. We just dissociate and then hide behind a script. And so how do we, I don't know.
Exactly what you're saying, and it should be noted that this ability to handle, like the mental model for handling is thinghood. I turn things into things and then I can handle them. So I reduce them into a thing so I can handle them, which is great as long as I remember to move out of thinghood, right? As long as I remember that. But here's the problem. The more and the better you get at treating things like things to handle, because you build stronger civilizations, you build more and more, the easier it is then to forget that thinghood.
And it becomes sticky.
Yes.
And then
you're in the internally consistent system. So that's the problem, is that thinghood is a very useful mental model for handling. But because it works, here's the key. The problem are mental models that work, not that don't work. It's the ones that work that create the habits that separate us from the root. And that's when we get in trouble. And you see, thinghood is such an incredibly powerful way to approach reality because it makes us able to handle reality. But that's precisely the trouble.
Temporary.
But it's temporary.
And the temptation is to use the temporary solution as a permanent orientation.
Yes.
And we're not identifying with that. Okay, so sorry, one more thing.
Please.
Maps. We get maps. That's the left hemispheric reception.
Yes.
So there's something about the self that kind of resonates with wave frequencies, and then that self then collapses the wave into a particular relation that's relevant to us. And then that understanding of the pattern recognition of the thing that's relative to us then becomes the left hemispheric chunk that we're then given. Or sorry, that becomes the chunk that our left hemisphere is then given. And then we are thrown into receiving this chunk. And so this is all, again, wave, particle, like there's like a wave, a right hemisphere, a time, a body. And then there's like the collapsed particle, the top down, the space, the mind, the intellect, the representation. And because the only thing we can latch onto and grasp is the quantifiable static, we are now confused because we think the graspable is the real. But at this point in the development of humanity, I would like to make the argument that actually that static habit is collapsing to something not real.
I agree.
And that's actually an illusion. What is supposed to be used temporarily has now become tempting to identify with. And so the map isn't the territory or something. We're aiming at the wrong... Sorry, I'm getting lost again.
No, that's exactly right.
We're aiming at particles, but it's actually how do you be present enough to interpret the waves into a particle? Not how do you take an already collapsed particle and then understand the particle.
That's correct.
It's how do you leave the particle into the presence of the wave.
That's correct.
Or something, again, this language is breaking down.
No.
But it's something...
This is all correct. Because, so there's a few things. So first off, if one understands reality as time, space versus space-time, it's easier not to make this mistake. Because you understand that anything you create is temporary. And funny enough, temporary is spatial. Like, the fact that it goes back into time means that that process is actually more real, right? So there's an interesting kind of...
and so it's only that which goes to the through line of multiple times. It's the atemporal thing that manifests through each apparent thing. And so like the MTC throws you into the facticity that says this is the monad. I like to call it an egg, but this is the egg you're thrown into. And it's like, no. Actually, you are that which goes through all of those monads.
That's correct.
And so what is more real is not what you can grasp.
Correct.
It's actually what humiliates or what evades your grasp or what is unknowable.
That's
so
correct.
Actually the paradox is that the more real is less knowable.
And
the more knowable is, the less real it is. So there's a...
Absolutely.
I don't know, paradox, irony,
the weird thing is that the only way to identify that which goes beyond your grasp is in your grasp. Because if you don't grasp it, then you could always plausibly say, no, it's not beyond my grasp, it's just that I haven't grasped it yet. When you grasp things and create thingshood, that's when you actually lose the plausible deniability that they're beyond your grasp. Because it's in your grasp that you see it's not even there. So in a sense, we're at the historical age. So there's a few things. First, the mistake of thinghood was actually historically necessary to get us here. Because we had to make things we grasped in order to realize we couldn't grasp them. And also, thinghood is how you got civilization, how you got, it created society. The problem today is not that we went through an age of thinghood. Hegel has this line where he says the fear of error is the fear of truth. He's like, you have to see the process. Every error is actually a necessary error to then get to the next step where you can see that as an error and have what he would call the negation of the negation. Like the error is the negation. You're making a mistake that you actually need to make to get to the place where you can see that as a mistake in what he would say sublate, right? So the fact that we've made the mistake of thinghood is actually not to say we did something wrong. It was historically necessary. The problem is if we overfit it now, is if we keep doing it. That's the mistake. Is if you keep doing it. Because keeping is the mistake if time is most real. Because you can't keep anything. There's only the change, right? So my argument, and I'll give it to you, my argument would be the revelation that thanehood is historically not appropriate now is global pluralism, is difference, is diversity, is networks, is encounter of otherness. That under those situations, a treating of things as most real habituates you into capacities that make you more fragile before the surprise of otherness, before the encounter of difference, because difference evades thanehood. And if all your habits and mental models are about reifying thanehood, then when you encounter difference, you have to kick it out. You have to get rid of it. And that's going to create, of course, small fascist states, totalitarianism, oppression, etc., so forth. So we need new habits that understand things are situations. They are processing,
Right.
but
Processes,
that would require us not to say, oh well, they did something wrong in the past. No, they did what was the historically. The funny idea in Hegel is that there are historically necessary errors. There are historically necessary errors, but those errors are actually the path to truth, because the only way to actually approach truth, because truth is excessive, you can never get the whole. It's apathetic, right? Well, by definition, if truth is apathetic and always beyond what we can comprehend, there's only one way to get at it, one error at a time, because you're never going to capture the whole. Like, the only way to approach God is by error, because you can never grasp all of God. But does that mean error equals false? No, it means incomplete. This is also the key, is that a historically necessary error is a necessary incompleteness, with the in kind of in parentheses, because unfolding is incomplete. But it is as complete as it can be at this moment. And but the logic of holding to something that is as complete as it can be in this moment, that the next moment will be incomplete, you can follow that if you're able to roll with it. If you have a temporal logic that can grasp, let go, grasp, let go, grasp, let go, that's no problem. It's if you're unable to do that, then the fact that the truth is this complete now and then incomplete, you're going to lose it, because you're going to get locked in a frame of space, and then when it no longer applies and it's moved beyond you, you're still back here, right? So you have to be able to keep going, and then you are as practically complete as can be in a process that never stops, right? Because you're always, in a sense, if this is the limit of time and you're here and it's moving and you're with it, then you are as complete as practically possible, because you're holding with the unfolding. But if the limit is here and you stop here and it keeps going, well, now there's a problem, right? So if temporality is most real, you've got to stick with it. But that means you have to always be letting go of the thinghood. There's more to say, but let me give it to you.
So there's something about, again, what I was saying is there's a presence that's like the capital self that then intuits or infers or like perceives or like collapses it into something that then gives it to the ego, and then we are the ego that is then thrown into the form, the structure. Yes. And so then there's something about that then our identities are that which act out these structures. And so then we identify with the structure, and then if our structure works, we get happy and confident, and if it doesn't work, then we get all sad. And so there's something about what I'm trying to get at is, if you can't access the real, and your only way of accessing the real is through traversing maps, then each one of your maps is a necessarily stepping stone in the direction,
Yes.
but it's not the destination.
Exactly.
And so what is it that transitions through maps but doesn't hold on to the map? But
Yes.
then also realizes that you need a map to take a step, but then also the map is insufficient. And
Yes.
so there's something about that where you have to realize that every map you use, every step you take is insufficient.
Yes.
And so every map that you think is correct, you then identify with.
Yes.
And so the mistake is to identify with the map,
Yes.
not that which walks through maps.
Yes.
And so my point that I'm actually trying to get at here is what happens when you realize that your map is insufficient. That feels like an error, which then feels like an identity crisis.
Yes.
And so I think the medicine to the meaning crisis is to treat yourself in these instances where you feel like your personality is breaking down and you're dying. You want to stop that. And I'm saying, no, those places where your map is breaking down is actually where you're accessing the real, and then that error is good. You want to consume that error, because then that's like eating the serpent of DNA that then is like a sperm that then reorients your egg to then shape your future ego, your egg, the ego, the personality, that which receives the information, then change and reorient.
Yes.
And then you're given a new ego that has a new information structure.
Yes.
And so the sin is to think that the map or the structure is you.
Yes.
It's actually you need to be able to let each map die.
Yes.
And then that feels like an excruciating Christ suffering, dying, and then that's what you need. The admitting of your error feels like ego death.
Yes.
And the admitting of error that feels like ego death is the precursor to wisdom, or is the precursor to knowledge, or realizing that as a child you were wrong is how you become an adult that has more wisdom.
Yes.
And so there's something about that paradoxically, the more you know that you're wrong, the more you've actually learned.
Yes.
And the more you are just being right and not getting any feedback is actually when you're becoming internally consistent.
Yes.
You're going into insanity
Yes.
and delusion.
Yes.
Like that everything is consistent and nothing is pushing up against me is actually a sign you're disconnected
Yes.
and not real.
Yes.
And then the sign that you're getting resistance and you need to change and you need to be reoriented feels humiliating, feels scary, it feels wrong.
Yes.
But paradoxically, that's the courage that you need to engage with. That's
Yes.
the dragon you need to confront. And then by confronting that dragon, you get the gold behind it. Or
Yes.
by then encountering that chaos, you learn from it. Or by fighting that demon, you become stronger. And then that's how you increase your atomic mass. That's how you become a better person. That's how you're more capable of confronting chaos.
Yes.
Is by doing that internal karmic journey to be honest and have integrity, and then something like that.
Perfectly put.
Again, I'm getting a little, I'm
perfectly
pulling out
put.
from all
But
different
this is why. So Hegel, this idea that the fear of error is the fear of truth, is exactly what he's
Right.
getting at. Is everything you just said, and the reason why
the left hemisphere, the ego, relies on a representation, but that will necessarily miss the mark. And so that representation is necessary an illusion. It's a tempting, empty calorie, missed mark
yes,
that feels good, and without the subtlety and without the presence and without the conscience and the sensitivity and the ability to through line, judge, and connect and understand and separate the wheat from the chaff, then you will be tempted to consume these ideologies and lose touch. But then it's more consistent, and then you get more momentum,
Yes.
and then you get dopamine, and then that
Yes.
feels good.
yes,
And so how do we tell people that actually that little dopamine that you're used to is the contagious sin, that is the curse that
Yes.
is pulling you away from your spiritual connection and your ability to understand reality?
correct.
Something like that?
Very well put. So for Hegel, one of the reasons he felt like logic needed an update, not that Aristotle was wrong with A is A, but there needed to be a kind of sublation, is because the logical form that we were operating in did not entail the possibility of error being right.
Right.
Like you see that, so our entire logic, language,
then-
semantics does not make space for the idea that A equals B is right. And so, because that would be wrong, that's an error. A doesn't equal B, and Hegel's like, no, error is actually correct.
Yeah.
And so, if we don't have a logic to think error as correct, we're done. We're going to end up in consistency, and that's
the metaphorical substrate, or that's the language. That's
Yes.
why I know I'm using this Overton window wrong, and but there's the ability to speak in the common language that
Yes.
then assumes that metaphorical substrate, that then narrows the mind, that then ignores the body, or something like that.
I
You
think
see how that feeds in it, and then that
Yes.
consumes it, and then that habituates it, and then that structures itself in the way
Yes.
that it has habitually been interpreting it, and then that becomes a spiritual interpretation that then like possesses itself, and then is a like
Yes.
sticky left hemisphere.
Absolutely. Well, I think the Overton window is great to bring in, because if you don't think this problem, you are stuck in the Overton window. You're going to be manipulated, right? Whatever the extreme thing is going to pull you over, and you're not going to have any way not to be pulled by the political discourse that's using the strategies of the Overton window. So I think that's appropriate. We could
But
go.
there's something about the structure of the language and the way that you communicate with other egos almost then makes you put it into left hemispheric static
Yes.
structure.
Yes.
And so it's almost, you almost can't communicate to somebody else because there isn't
Yes.
that faithful presence of literally sharing the same nervous system.
Correct.
We are people of different nervous systems that then have to pretend to relate using abstractions.
Yes.
And so the problem is we're no longer communally neurologically oriented.
Correct.
We are all abstractly
Yes.
pretending
Yes.
to communicate,
Yes.
and that's, to me, that's the Tower of Babel.
Yes.
Is we're all technically saying the same words, but they mean different things, and so we're
Yes.
up here and we're down here, and we're disconnected, and what we're saying isn't what we mean, and that's the presentation and the representation, and then
Yes.
Sorry, I'm getting lost here.
No, everything is exactly correct. And also, I wanted to say that when you were saying the difference between identifying with maps versus what go through maps, that's
Yes.
exactly right.
Yes, yes.
To me, to dwell in the Gödel point is to identify with what is going through maps. What I will
Would that be then the map maker, or the explorer that then writes a map that then shares the map, or like?
To be in the Gödel point is to identify that maps are necessary, but they're for the sake of finding the point of the error in the map to open up, not to identify with the map, but actually to find where the map isn't the territory, and to emphasize that as a commonality with other people in other maps who must also have Gödel points, and that can be the universal experience of the map failure that can actually be a connection point between all people that unveils that maps are actually platforms of a subject, of the person, that the person is not reducible to their maps. Please.
I don't know. There's something that I'm not quite getting, but there's something about the way that you were just talking there was almost like speaking as if the Gödel point is a specific point that we can then access. And by then knowing that, you're almost then enclosing a system and delineating where the Gödel point is.
This is the tricky move. Yeah.
Like we were talking about earlier, I can't remember exactly what it was, but then I was like, oh yeah, then we're fucked.
Yeah.
Because that's the same thing, is once you start to think you know where that point is,
you're
then
done.
You're no longer in the point.
That's correct.
And so there's
this
something
is very
about like
important.
once you
Very
determine
important.
it and once you collapse it and once you aim
Yes.
at it,
Yes.
then you are mistaken.
Yes,
And
you're
so
correct.
so it's I wanted to object at the way
No,
that
no,
you're
no,
speaking,
it's-
but that's just the metaphorical
No,
substrate
no,
of how
no,
you communicate to another abstracted person with a different nervous system. So-
This is the no.
But this is the meaning crisis.
This
I
is a
think-
huge
I think
issue.
This is like
To dwell in the
part-
Gödel
part of it.
point
This
is
part of it.
a way to describe you are always working to be. The Gödel point must surprise you. You can't
so it's
pick
like
it.
a present. It's like
It's-
it's an unknown.
Yes, it's a mystery in your map that you're always working to find. Like, and you
Right.
never identify with the consistency because that stops the movement. You are trying to always dwell in the Gödel point in the sense that you are treating your map as always containing the potential of this surprise that then means you can't this is the weird move that is entailed in the completeness of your map. This surprise where your map fails is the very point that makes it possible for it to appear as entirely coherent, and yet the entirety of its coherence is actually the revelation that it can't be complete. Because if it is, there's no excess, and then it's closed, right? It would be unreal. That's the weird move that's, in my opinion, very hard to get with Kurt Gödel's incompleteness theorem, is that it is the very completeness of a set of numbers that unveils that set of numbers cannot be axiomatically grounded. It is the very fact, reality is an open, let's put it this way, reality is an open system. So if your system is closed, it can't be real.
Right.
That's the weird move.
Right. That's the key. Yeah.
And so
how do you identify as a presence that is open without collapsing and then not caring for yourself? Like remember the organ. It's like, how do you maintain the selectively permeable membrane that establishes that you're a liver and not a kidney?
Yes.
But then how do you not close off the blood flow that you're not getting nutrients? And so where's the connection and the separation, and how do you believe that you're connected, and how do you believe that you're separate? And my concern is that, again, that Overton window of the metaphorical substrate of the objective landscape doesn't allow for that contradiction. Doesn't allow for you to be closed liver and open to the body.
Yes.
And so what is this where we are properly closed off, but also properly open? And so we are improperly barriering ourselves, and I think it's because we're aiming our barriers with our ration, or with our reason, with our intellect, with whatever that fallen thrown into is.
Yes.
And so we're using the reductive thrown into as a pretense of the, and so then we've usurped, and then we're acting instead of, and then we're insane.
Everything. So this idea of how do you be properly closed and properly open?
Yeah.
This is basically everything. This is everything, and it all comes. And if this is not addressed, politically, economically, socially, we're done. We're in huge trouble. Unless you would like to close down global pluralism, which would require. If you can, let me put it this way: if the average person you encounter is similar enough to you, then even if you can't solve this problem, you will practically solve it on average, because most people will just naturally, by their beliefs, be properly open and properly closed enough because they're similar enough to you, right? So this is where, if you can't deal with this issue, you're going to see isolationist strategies, you're going to see return to small fascist states, you're going to see closing down. But then the argument would be, following the real speculations with Gödel, technology fundamentally is pluralistic. With the internet, it is open, right? So unless you want to employ censorship or have the internet restricted by nation, you start having all of that. But then, of course, the flow of capital is necessarily pluralistic, right? So in order to survive and not deal with this problem, you'd have to cut yourself off from global capitalism and from technology, which this is why the paper says basically a lot of these strategies to neoliberalism are actually more Amish than they realize. Because a lot of people don't understand that the Amish are not anti-technology. They have a democratic process of voting on what technology they have and what not, right? So basically...
It's recognizing that there's a trade-off in technology.
Yes.
I think the MTC thinks that technology is good.
Yes.
And so we think that grasping onto things is good.
Yes.
And so we think that being technological and grasping onto things and making static plans that are predictable is good.
Yes, that's correct. And so,
But that's literally the exact same thing as selling your soul to the devil.
yes,
And that's like literally Cain's credo. That's the
Yes.
Cain-like mentality.
The-
That's the what is it? The taker culture. That is the that which doesn't have faith in its ability to manage the other. It then needs to delineate and predict and secure.
absolutely. I mean, AI in that sense is very Luciferian. I mean, it is absolutely a sort of demonic logic. Now, of course,
So
there's
it's not bad in and of itself, but it only becomes bad when that takes over.
yes,
When that dominates the psyche, when
Yes.
that becomes auto-cannibalistic,
Yes.
when that no longer shares the energy.
yes,
And so again, like that McGillchrist attention of the hemispheres, it's like the left hemisphere is given the nugget and then holds on to the map as though that is real.
yes,
And there's no longer sharing. It's like the right hemisphere doesn't know what's happening.
yes,
And then it sends it to the left, and the left's like, okay, this is
Yes.
what's happening.
yes,
But then you can't step in the same river twice. And so
Mhm.
then as soon as the left has fucking established it, then it's not what's there.
yeah, that's
And
right.
so then it's how do we understand that
Yes,
what's there is not what's here, and that we can
Yes.
talk about what's
Yes.
here, but then that's not where we are. And so what we can
Yes.
talk about isn't what's relevant.
yes,
And so we need to be facing forward, not talking backwards.
yes,
And we have created a community around talking backwards.
yes,
And then that is a tempting deception to not take responsibility for opening the eye of attention and moving forward.
yes,
And if we are, again, the canonical and the biblical, if that then breaks down to Egypt, and then if our God is the attention that is atop of all the other hierarchies, then what is that attention that isn't thrown into the fallen collapse?
yes, yes, that's correct.
And so how do we then access that greater attention
Yes,
that isn't motivated by the static, graspable known?
yes,
And then how do we realize that that graspable known is the temptation of is like more like a temptation of ignorance or a temptation of deceit, or what we think we orient and what brings us psychic comfort in the ideologies that stabilize us are actually that which is disorienting, that which is splitting us.
yes,
And so what we are consuming as comfort food is actually the irony that is pulling us away from what ought to be imported.
yes,
We are purporting something top down, and we're not importing something. We're pretending something, we're not metabolizing something. We're not living it as an accepted life, we're pretending it as a top down, something like that.
completely.
Yeah,
I think quantification, knowledge, the AI, computer, potential demonic, is very good as long as it doesn't replace the qualitative, the real, the
Right, it's a
encounter.
supplement.
It's
It
a
can't
supplement.
be a replacement.
No, the mistake is, and it just makes me. And
That's the tempting, is
Yes.
that it's that's what we consume, and so then we think that's what's real. And
Ba-
so then
yes,
we replace
yes.
that with the... Yeah, sorry.
That's 100%. And a way to kind of describe it is, if I'm going to the Leibniz example, is Leibniz brings something to our attention. He's like, you actually can't count. What's the difference? So if I say there's 1 apple, 2 apple, 3 apple, 4 apple, and I count, he's like, hey, what are you counting exactly? You're counting a quality. That's an apple, that's an apple, that's an apple. So the only way you can even quantify is it because there's a quality.
Right, is it to represent
And so the mistake, he says, a lot of people, he says, okay, what's the difference between 1 apple, 2 apple, 3 apple, and me going 1, 2, 3? The key is realizing the second is actually not counting, it's listing numbers. When I just say 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, all I'm doing is listing numbers. I'm not actually counting. Counting requires a quality that I'm counting.
Okay.
Now, you could argue I'm
like a
counting.
correspondence.
Yes, that's right.
So
If I
consistent counting is just a consistency.
That's
I'm
correct.
sorry. Labeling numbers is just a
Listing is
but
consistency.
then counting would be
Correspondence. That's correct. And if you say 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 is counting, you would have to say, well, they share the quality of being numbers. They share the quality of being numbers that don't correspond. So you literally cannot quantify unless there's quality, and the quality has to come first. And so what ends up happening, though, is that quantification works so well, you forget the quick act of quality that you're counting. You forget it.
Right.
And once that occurs, you're damned. Because you lose track of, wait a minute, the only way I'm able to quantify is because there's a quality that I'm quantifying. 1, 2, 3, 4 apples. There are 4 apples, so I'm counting apples. But then, of course, where's the quality come from then? Judgment.
So
there's a human intelligibility that is saying that is an apple. And so there's a human element that is inseparable from quantification, because we identify qualities. Please.
So then there's something like that, the quality and the quantity maps on again to kind of the map and the territory.
Yes.
And the point of a map isn't to like sit in the cockpit of your vehicle and then like steer your thing across the map.
Yes.
The point is to look at the map and see where the rivers are and see where the
Yes.
mountains are, and then like you have to step on this rock and you have to step over this crack,
Yes.
and then you have to slightly walk around this tree.
Yes.
And so the map is a reference point, but the point of what you're doing is to be present and to
Yes.
navigate the territory.
Yes.
And so the map is like a tool to guide
Yes.
your
It's
presence.
a guide. Yes.
It's not, oh, this map is the directions, and now I'm just going to program the directions,
Yes.
and then the map is what's real.
Yes.
And so there's something about that where we think the map is real, we think the left hemisphere is real, we think that the
Yes.
space is real, we think that the quantity is real. And so then we send quantitative data of objective
Yes.
linear landscapes.
Yes.
And technically none of that matters.
Yes.
None of that is significant.
Yes.
That is only significant once you've shared a metaphorical substrate, once
Yes.
you've shared a nervous system, once
Yes.
you've shared a community, once
Yes.
there's a connected, embodied
Yes.
relation, grounding roots. Once there's roots, then that stuff makes sense.
Yes.
But what we're doing is we're in the Tower of Babel and we're not rooted together. And then we're just spitting concepts at each other.
Yes.
And then we're like, oh, well, that concept sounds like my concept. We're saying the same thing.
Yes.
We're on the same team.
Yes.
And it's like, well, no.
I think that is very well
And
put.
so it's not the quantity, it's the quality.
Yes.
It's not the word, it's the experience. It's not the map, it's the territory.
Correct.
It's not the representation, it's how you are present.
Yes.
And so we have made an identity confusion
Yes.
where we have built our personalities by thinking top down and identifying which top downs,
Yes.
which means we've identified as not having a body, which means we can
Yes.
repress our emotions
Yes.
and we can ignore our emotions.
Yes.
And in some sense, like if you're hungry but there's work to do, like you want to override your hunger so that
Yes.
you can do something. And so like I'm not, again, it's subtle. It's a subtle difference, and we're not managing that understanding of the identity of what is more important.
Yes.
We're taking the collapsed yin known left hemisphere that we can grasp onto, and because that's how the ego can grasp onto, that's what orients the ego, and we think we are the ego, that is now elevated to our primary hierarchy.
Yes.
And that's the original sin. It's
Yes.
like, no, the primary hierarchy is that would embodied territorial mover,
Yes.
the participant. It's not the thinker, it's not the representer, it's not the territory. I mean, it's not the map, it's
Yes.
not the, yeah, sorry.
I completely agree. And as you were speaking, it's a funny thing. Aquinas said that angels were minds without bodies. It's kind of funny because if humans become minds without bodies, the only kind of angel we can be is a fallen angel because we weren't made to be angels. So there's something Luciferian in that.
Sure.
I think also maps are supposed to be to the glory of territory, not to their replacement. Understanding is supposed to be to the glory of the fullness. But the issue is, so there's a few things. So the question becomes, why are we so prone to replace quality with quantification, to replace process with things, and etc.? And the problem is because it's pleasurable to understand. It's pleasurable.
It's familiar, you get a dopamine fix. Like
Yes.
There's something consuming about that. There's something familiar and consuming that foes as fluency that feels real.
Yes, you have to. It's kind of like, so Lacan and these kind of psychoanalysis, they warn that the brain is drenched in libido. It's drenched in the pleasure principle. It wants to
Everything
enjoy.
is creation.
And so when I say that's 4 apples, then I feel like I understand. There's something pleasurable about that. I feel like I have a grasp on things.
You could reduce it.
But if I say to you that's an apple, and I say, well, what's that? If you think about it, an apple's kind of you got to explore it. You got to think about it. So if I present things,
it's a nesting of potential. It's
Yes.
a network of
Yeah.
potentials. It could be anything.
it's correct. And so if I just give you this as an apple, like be the Cézanne painter and really pay attention to it and really look, it's like,
Collapsed
well,
particle,
it's-
then there's nothing there, and I don't care about it.
yeah, that's right. And
So
if
then
and
that collapse thing that you just gave me, I don't care about.
exactly.
So then why would you give me something? So you would have to give me something real, right?
Yep.
Or, yeah, sorry.
Yeah, and well, if the issue is, if I give you an apple and you go, why am I giving this to me? There's 2 responses. I just say, well, pay attention. And you can say, no, hand it back. Or I've just invited you into a mystery. And if I've invited you into a mystery, then you might have to change your entire life. Because if you could literally see this apple, if you were to really see this apple for the first time, really see something, then all of reality is now different. because that experience that you could have of that apple could now be brought to every phenomenon you could bring, right?
And so I think that's the way.
Mm-hmm.
I think that's what the religions are trying to get at.
Yes.
I think that's what wisdom is getting at.
Yes.
I think that's what proper awareness is, or proper participation, or whatever, faithful presence, whatever your words are.
Yes.
I think that sort of being on the cross of the vertical dimension and the horizontal dimension, being either or and both and left hemispheres.
Yes.
Understanding the tree of knowledge and the tree of life.
Yes.
Understanding a lived embodied experience and a top down.
Yes.
And so there's something where we're like either one or the other, but really the only one we can actually talk about is the left, and so it's always that left hemisphere top down intellectual represented quantity that then is irrelevant or is insignificant or something. And so then we are orienting around something we think is going to be significant, and then we orient towards it, and then we are not fulfilled.
Yes.
And then we blame fate. And it's like, well, until you make the unconscious conscious, it'll direct your life, and you'll call it fate. Until you realize that you're aiming at abstracted representations is going to be the fact that you're never present, and you always blame fate for being unfair. And it's like, well, no, it's not fate that's unfair. It's just you're confused. You're psychically disoriented, and then in your own disorientation, you hurt yourself. It's not that the world is wrong, or like whatever God is wrong. It's that you were confused, and then in your own belief of your own confusion, well, then you blame fate because that's not you. Yeah. And so I'm not to blame. That's something else.
Yes.
I'm the faithful follower of my map.
Yeah. Right.
It's whoever gave you the map that's to blame.
Yes. That's right.
And what you need to realize is that no, you're the map maker.
Yes.
You gave yourself that map.
Yes.
And so you don't get to sit here and blame and complain that you were given a wrong map.
Correct.
You were the coward that chose to hide behind your satanic map and use the map instead of your presence.
Yes.
And so then in V for Vendetta, if you want somebody to blame, look in the mirror.
Yes.
I don't know if you remember where he took over the thing, and then he tells them, and it's like, oh yeah, well, there was fascism, and there was murder, and there was all these reasons. There were all these reasons for you to be scared and to hide behind your rationality. Yes. But now that you live in a totalitarian state, like at some point, like look in the mirror, dude. Yeah. And so it's like that's what I'm trying to get at. This as above, so below thing is it's like we don't realize how much we are hiding from ourselves by thinking our way out of situations. Yes. Or something to that effect. Yes. We end up lying to ourselves to hide behind a static idea. Yes. And then we're no longer faithfully present, and then we're no longer maturing and gaining wisdom. We're actually atrophying, becoming more immature, becoming more irresponsible. Yes. And then with great power comes great responsibility. Yes. We are putting all of our money into increasing technology, and then we've just totally forgotten about wisdom. We've totally atrophied connection and religio, the binding to the unconscious, whatever that correspondence to the vertical is. Yes. We're just putting steroids in the horizontal. We're just putting steroids in the linear. And we're not getting the spherical. We're not getting the vertical. Correct. We're not getting the unconscious. We're not tapping into the right hemisphere. We're not tapping into the present embodiment of the through line of connection and that resonates to life. Yes. We are just whatever we think this fallen, separate, abstracted ego that uses its saber intellect to then manage known chunks. Yes. Which then is an anti-life philosophy. Yes. Because you're aiming at the static chunks, which means you believe in death. Yes. Which means you're no longer living and consuming life. Correct. Which means you're then going to get into an auto-cannibalistic, self-destructive, self-deceptive. Exactly. And so how do we then be whatever the philosopher, the alchemist, the mystic, the religious, the priest, how do you get the person to confront their own darkness, to confront their own shadow, to enter their own God image, to deal with their own real inside of themselves so that they don't think themselves out of being present to themselves? Yes. And so that's my biggest concern is that not only are we misrepresenting everything else, but we're actually misrepresenting ourselves. Mm-hmm. And so then this is even more of an internal meaning crisis because it isn't out there. Yeah. The meaning crisis is actually my own cowardice, my own V for Vendetta looking in the mirror of hiding behind more rules because there's scary people out there, because I'm afraid of the stranger, because I'm too weak to deal with the stranger. Yes. And so in my cowardice and my inability to deal with the stranger, I'm going to hide behind some structure that I already know. Yes. And then I'm going to get a dopamine fix off of how cool I am hiding behind my structure. Yes. All the while, I'm just being a coward and avoiding reality. Yes, that's it. And that's how our society thinks. Yeah. So how do we not do that? Well, how do we not do whatever I just said over the last 3 minutes? And if we... How are we encouraged to step outside of that facticity we feel like we're thrown into and remember the faithful presence that taps into the greater self that then can reorient the ego and can do things that were previously thought impossible? Yes. If we cannot do that... How do we tap into that magic? Yes. Basically,
doing what you just said is the question of if we can handle global pluralism without disaster. If we cannot do this, we're basically doomed.
If we can't reconnect to our presence,
yeah, we're doomed.
We're
doomed. And from talks with Gödel, this is a question of if we can move from an age of maps to an age of absolute knowing. So we talked about the age of givens to the age of maps, age of absolute knowing. If we cannot make this move, it's done. Global pluralism will destroy itself. There's a few.
Can you get into that absolute knowing? Maybe in the context of the maps, and then being the map, and then what's kind of beyond the map or something.
Absolutely.
Can you connect those dots?
Absolute knowing in Hegel is basically the realization that limitation is actually why we're able to think. Like, limitation is good. So in Kant, limit is like thinking, here's limit, and thinking is here, and limit stops thinking. We don't have to think limit because we're contained in limit. In Hegel, limit is in thinking for thinking. We are actually limited so that we can think. And of course, we can look at this in terms of if reality is excessive, the reason we're limited is so reality doesn't destroy us. The limit is for us, actually. An absolute knowing, when it's not like I know everything. It's realizing that at the point where knowledge achieves its absolute zenith, you're going to encounter a limit, but it's a limit that moves, and so you have to humble yourself. You have to follow the limit. So absolute knowing is not some kind of enlightenment. It's the absolute point where knowing can go no further, but that is not because knowing is trapped from the noumenon in the Kantian sense. That's because every moment there is a limit that is historically necessary so that thought can advance, and it's a historically necessary error.
And
but
that's
that
going through the maps.
That's it.
Map to
Yes.
map to map to map.
That's
to map.
exactly right.
And it's not any one map, but
No, it's the through line.
It's the through line.
It's the through line.
This is the ability to know that you are more than the map.
Yes.
To know that you are that which is
Yes.
using the map as a tool to navigate the territory.
That's it.
And
That's
there's
it.
something about being Homo sapiens that we take for granted the sapiential framework. And
Yes.
so we take for granted the map.
Yes.
And so there's something sticky about human nature that makes us pretend we are the map.
Yes.
And then that's the great forgetting that disconnects us from the spirit
Yes.
that transitions through maps, which then could be this absolute knowing or something.
Yes.
Can we,
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
How does that?
Completely. Because that's why the phenomenology of spirit is basically it's walking through history. It's showing the movement of how we become conscious, then we become self-conscious, and then we encounter reason. There's this movement of always hitting a limit, and you hit a limit, and you hit another limit. Like you get self-consciousness, and then I encounter you and realize, wait a minute, this other person's consciousness is not reducible to mine. Now I could choose to pretend like you don't exist, but if I choose to believe you exist, I move from self-conscious to reason. And then once reason then sees, say, a collective soul, so it moves to spirit, etc., etc. So there's this movement of Geist, which we can just think of as spirit or mind. There are different ways to word it. But the point is that thinking advances by an encounter with limit. But the moment it encounters that limit, it then reconstitutes an identity to itself in light of that limit. So it becomes other. It's always becoming something different.
Yeah. So then that, I don't know about Hofstadter and Strange Loops in the co-creation.
Sure.
And so there's something about that where we consume our own maps and then we create ourselves to be in the shape of those maps.
Yeah, absolutely.
And then there's something, I don't know.
But here's the tricky, so the problem becomes, once you get to religion, so it's consciousness, self-consciousness, reason, you get spirit, religion, absolute knowing. The problem so every one of these steps is necessary. None of these are like less than the other, right? And actually for Hegel, in a sense, thought has already done them all, right? It's already come to, it's just that we as subjects haven't realized it. The problem that can happen is that in religion, as Hegel describes it, the limit is no longer self-evident. Like the limit seems to go away because you get an internally consistent system, basically. So you have to choose to believe the limit is there even if you don't naturally experience it. And that's basically our problem now. That's what we're getting at, right? We've created internally consistent systems. So the limit doesn't appear in our experience of the world because we could choose to believe that quantity is above quality, A is below A and B. And it's not like reality is going to stop us. It's not like if you make this mistake, it is not like reality is going to stop you until the apocalypse, until the disaster. And then, here's the other horror. Let's say you experience the trauma that's the invitation into relation versus thanehood. Well, you don't have to choose to go into relation. You could choose for the, well, damnation, to end the trauma, which could be the grace, to actually still stay on the Luciferian direction. So even you could experience beauty and then choose to forget it the next day, right? And that's kind of the super damnation point, right?
I think that's how modern society conditions you to be.
Yes, yes.
To experience beauty, to be overwhelmed, to dissociate, and then to go back to your satanic, non-beautiful life.
Yes, and
it's like beauty is now scary, and so now we almost like are aversive to beauty, or we're like afraid of it, and then we reason ourselves out of it, and then we structure something, and then we.
And this is the key difference.
I think that's the courage we need, is to engage with that beauty, to relate to that beauty, to be inspired, to be humble, and then to try to rise up to that beauty.
Absolutely. This, to me, is the key difference of why the movement to absolute knowing is somewhat, in my opinion, different from other movements, because the other movements, if you grant it, basically force you to identify the limit, but absolute knowing, you are not forced to identify the limit. You could actually just interpret it to go back into A is A. So there's a contingency at absolute knowing that is historically unique. Now, I say that, but then I also should note that you could get stuck in reason. It is not necessarily the case, but there's something about absolute knowing that is uniquely difficult, because it is precisely the experience of the excess itself. When you, not to get too much into Hegel, because it's not necessarily here, what I think the difference is that when you reach the limits of reason, you really do experience the limits of reason. You experience it in terms of autonomous rationality, totalitarianism, and all these things. You say there is a need for spirit, right? And also, spirit seems to present itself more easily when you look around, because people are going into meditative retreats. They are looking to Eastern philosophy. They are looking, there's kind of a sense that spirit is given by the society. Well, then you go into spirit, and then when you're in spirit, with time, it becomes very natural to say, oh, spirituality has its limits without religion. You need religion because if you have spirituality without religion, you have no community, you lose family, and so you need religion, right? So there can be a movement that's quite natural to religion. But then as you move into religion, the next step is basically, you could say, an identification of God as apathetic versus overly capathetic, right? There is nowhere in religion that forces you to make that move. Right?
What's the difference? Apathetic and capathetic.
Capathetic would be an emphasis on God as present, as your models. You know, this is the danger of, like, some of the great mystics, I guess you could say, like a Master Eckhart, warn that it's kind of better to say God is not God than to say God is God or God is not good, because your idea of the good is so much a restatement of what your map, that it's almost better to say God is not good, so that you remember that God is transcendent of your understanding.
Yes.
That's correct.
Yeah.
That's correct. So there's an idea.
So then that's where the A is A gets so wrong.
Yes.
Because that thinks that the phenomenon is the representation.
Yes.
And we need to be present in the phenomenon,
yes,
but then we can kind of use representations to orient us.
That's correct.
But the primary root of experience has to be beyond that.
That's correct. The problem with A is it's a capathetic logic, and Hegel's basically like, we need to think logic from an apathetic posture, and that's going to completely transform the categories of logic. And he presents those in the Science of Logic, which occurs precisely at absolute knowing. Like, the phenomenology of spirit is a phenomenology that actually creates the stage for Hegel's philosophy proper, which is thinking the categories of logic from the standpoint of absolute knowing, which is from an apathetic position. From, okay, what does it mean to know something if everything we know is in excess of our categories? What exactly are categories then, if all they are is representations that are not actual? What do we do when we think? If when we think
what are we talking about if what we're saying is insufficient?
Exactly. And yet, talking matters. And yet, that insufficiency is somehow sufficient in some sense. Right. It's just not totally sufficient.
So what's with that paradox? Because there's something here where it's like, Jung says that the wise person can see the paradox, or can see the polarity, the bipolarity of everything.
Yes. Well, the issue is that this is where Hegel is like, the contradiction is where thought is the birthplace of thought. The contradiction is not the thing that we don't have.
That's the real. That's the presence. That's where. That's the Gödel point. That's
exactly right.
And so it's like, how do you be present with the non-map?
Yes.
Not how do you know what the hole in your map is shaped like?
Yes.
But it's
Yes, that's exactly right.
Something like that.
To dwell in the contradiction, to dwell in the contradiction.
To attend to the contradiction, to be a, because that's the A is non-contradiction.
Yes.
And that's not real. That's how the mind processes, and that's how we find comfort.
Yes. Yes.
But that doesn't actually correspond.
No.
And so that's a correlation, not a correspondence.
That's exactly right.
And so how do we remember that we aren't the ego monkey mind that correlates to its own ideas in an auto-cannibalistic way?
Yes.
How do we remember that we're a self that whose maps need to correspond to something outside of what we feel like we're thrown into?
Yes.
And so how do we not identify with that fallen thing that manages the particulars? And then how do we re-identify with the transcendent thing that then collapses particulars?
Yes. How do we remember AB, or contradiction, when every act of understanding is of an AA that trains us into a habit against the contradiction? That's exactly right. Absolutely.